Hi, this is Ariana Bondi,
And this is Alex Vardy.
and we will be discussing the 1920s and the authors of the time.
The 1920s are commonly associated with vibrant culture, urbanization, wealth, and the advent of truly modern living. The United States was in the middle of a technological revolution. Certain luxuries were becoming commonly available, the economy was thriving, and decadent lifestyles were lived by many. Also, coming off its First World War, citizens were now wary of the dangers of such a conflict. The writing in this decade showcased bursts of energy, hopefulness, a sense of boundless potential, but also had many underlying warnings and lessons. Many of the books from this decade had massive cultural impacts, resulting in them being extremely popular. Also, it is important to note that the 1920s produced some of the most classic writing pieces of all time. Without further ado, let's look into the literature and authors of the 1920s. Alright, so Ariana, tell me a little bit about F. Scott Fitzgerald.
So he was the most prominent one in the authors of the 1920s, arguably, and he was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1896. He started writing for his school newspapers. Then he got into Princeton University, but dropped out to pursue his writing career and join the army. He fought in World War I, and his rival writer was Hemingway. The most prominent book he produced at the time was The Great Gatsby. Afterwards, he moved to New York and published This Side of Paradise. Gatsby is a social commentary of life at the time, comparing the luxurious life of the rich and their excessive spending versus the struggling poor class. At the time, people went into a consumer society and life was luxurious. There was a mass culture change. Parties became a regular occurrence and everyone drank. More than it being just a great story, this book encapsulates the culture of the 1920s. The book shows how after World War I, the economy was booming and Americans were making so much money and basking in their wealth. Both the main character, Tom and Gatsby, are World War I veterans, and they share their experiences from the war. In the beginning of the 20s, and the 18th Amendment was enforced, and speakeasies and purchasing of illegal liquor was increased, which also was seen in the book. One of the characters, Jordan Baker, was a female character who pushed against the society at the time where girls were not treated as equal as men. She is single and goes out of her way to meet many men and acts very independent. This gave women insight into how women can escape from society's holds. Most importantly, this book brought to light the massive gap between the rich and the poor. While the rich were living their luxurious life, the lower class was struggling immensely.
And one fun fact about this book, it actually, upon release, was not very popular, and it wasn't until World War II when this book became extremely popular among soldiers who would read it during their time across seas in Europe fighting.
Now, Alex, tell us about the next author.
So the next author we'll be discussing is Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was, before he really got into his writing career, a medic stationed with the Red Cross in Italy during World War I. During a battle, he suffered a serious injury from mortar fire while assisting soldiers, and his recovery took 6 months. These experiences stayed with him and influenced much of his writing. This could be seen in his first and most critically acclaimed novel, The Sun Also Rises, which was released in 1926. This explores the detrimental and indelible effect of war on the generation of fighters in World War I as they tried to navigate their lives after the war. Their traditional perceptions of morality and faith are destroyed by the harshness of the war, leaving them emotionally wrecked and leading aimless lives. They distract from their empty lives with constant drinking, partying, and sex, which were also themes of the 1920s. These brought them a fake sense of joy. This book helped show the American public that war was not a glorious and painless venture, but was in fact a truly horrible thing and had the ability to permanently detriment a whole generation.
Wow, Alex, that is a very powerful lesson.
Alright, so now I'm going to talk about Langston Hughes. Hughes' literature included a wide range of novels, plays, poems, and newspapers, and was centered around African American life. One of Hughes' most famous works a poem entitled As I Grew Older, discussed the American dream and how it was denied to many African Americans. In the poem, the sun, which represents the speaker's dream, is quickly obstructed by a rising brick wall, leaving the speaker in darkness and his dream out of sight. This poem stirred action in the African American community towards their fight for equality, rights, and opportunity. Langston Hughes is such a vital author to the decade, as he fought to bring attention to an issue as old as America itself, and one that quietly endured during the prosperous 20th century, the issue of civil rights. His writing brought common African American troubles to the eyes of countless Americans, hoping to stir change. He also wrote in great detail about the accomplishments and complex lives of the African Americans to show that blacks were no different from whites and therefore deserved the same rights.
The next author is Gertrude Stein. She was born near Pittsburgh in 1874. Stein left great impacts on the 20s with her writing. Not only this, she supported some of the finest artists at the time, like Hemingway, Picasso, and many others. She planned to be a doctor and even made it through all 4 years of medical school at Johns Hopkins, but there was a lot of unfairness to women, so she left. During World War I, Stein contributed to the war effort by driving cars to help wounded French soldiers. She barely knew how to drive and would practice but never truly got the hang of it. This clearly did not stop her. In her book, Taking the Wheel, Women and the Coming of the Motor Age, she describes her contributions and tribulations when working in the war effort for the wounded soldiers. She says she never truly mastered driving. Her writing touched upon sexism and feminism, something that was rarely spoken about for that time period. Tender Buttons, the first book she published, purposely lacked conventional grammar and logic. It was an avant-garde feminist piece. Gertrude Stein was a woman who thrived on her own. She didn't need the support of a husband. She wrote about sexuality and her love for her partner, Alice Toklas. Stein portrayed women as individuals that could make their own roles for themselves. She inspired many at the time. One of her famous quotes is, "One must dare to be happy." T.S. Eliot was born on September 26, 1888, in St. Louis, Missouri. He died in London, England. Although he was born in the United States, he later took up England's citizenship. He was born into a prestigious family, and his dad never pushed him to be a businessman. Instead, he encouraged in his career. He went to Harvard and finished his degree in 3 years instead of 4. He was friendly with other poets at the time, like Ezra Pound. He would always limit himself to 3 hours a day of writing, even if he wanted to do more. His most famous poem was The Wasteland. The Wasteland talks about the mess that Eliot considered modern culture. This was particularly after the First World War had ravaged Europe. Through his poetry, he used language to envision the way society should be. He influenced many other poets at the time to go out of boundaries and not follow his conditional methods. A short excerpt from his poem is, "April is the cruelest month. Breeding, lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring, dull roots with spring's rain." Lastly, we have Edith Wharton. Wharton was born into an extremely wealthy family, and the family was distinguished. Growing up, she received the finest tutors for education. She married a wealthy Boston banker. Wharton's 1920 novel, The Age of Innocence, was directly influenced by her wealthy lifestyle. The novel won the Pulitzer Prize. The book explored the lives of the wealthiest and most powerful members of society. Although the story took place during the 19th century, many of the circumstances in the novel remained in the 1920s. Despite the comfortable lives lived by the rich, there were many stringent formalities that they had to follow, which restricted them greatly. A prime example of this is when the main character, Newland Archer, falls in love with a girl outside of his social standing, and is unable to marry her because of this. This book showed that money could not buy happiness, and that sometimes the richest are the most distraught. This release was quite timely, as it was read vicariously by many members of the lower class who were disillusioned about their lives of the upper class. They were not perfect as they had imagined. Thanks for listening. This has been Alex and Ariana on Authors of the 1920s.